In January 1945, at the Los Angeles Open, a golfer teed off in a field of professional men and shot rounds good enough to make the cut. That had never happened before. A woman had entered a men's professional tournament, played 2 rounds against the best male players in America, and survived to play the weekend. Her name was Babe Didrikson, and within a few years, the organization running men's professional golf had made sure that nobody would be doing that again. This is the story of the greatest all-round athlete the United States has ever produced. A woman who was so completely dominant across so many different sports that people genuinely accused her of making it up. And what happened when she walked into the one arena that had decided she didn't belong. And the ending is not the part you expect, because the last chapter of her life is somehow more astonishing than everything before it. Start with where she came from, because nothing about it suggests any of this. She was born Mildred Ella Didrikson in 1911 in Port Arthur, Texas, to Norwegian immigrant parents. 7th child, her father was a carpenter and a former seaman. The family had very little money, and after a hurricane damaged their home, they moved inland to Beaumont. Her father built exercise equipment in the backyard out of scrap, weights made from broomsticks and flat irons, a hurdle course essentially, out of the neighbors' hedges, which she used to practice jumping on her way down the street. She got the nickname Babe as a child, and the origin story that stuck is that she hit 5 home runs in a single baseball game, and somebody compared her to Babe Ruth. And here's the thing that separates her from every other prodigy story. She wasn't good at one sport. She was, from very early on, apparently good at all of them, immediately, without the normal apprenticeship. Basketball first. She was recruited out of high school by an insurance company in Dallas to play on their industrial league team, which was how serious women's sport worked at the time. Companies sponsored teams, and the players nominally held jobs. She was named an All-American. Her team won a national championship, then track and field. And this is where the story becomes genuinely absurd. In 1932, the Amateur Athletic Union held its national championships, which doubled as the Olympic trials. Teams arrived with full squads. Babe arrived as a one-woman team, entered on behalf of her employer, and competed in 8 events. She won 5 of them outright. She set world records in the process, and she scored enough points on her own to win the entire team championship, beating the 22-woman team that finished second. One athlete, one afternoon, a national team title. She then went to the Los Angeles Olympics, where the rules of the time limited women to 3 events. She won gold in the javelin. She won gold in the 80-meter hurdles, in a world record. And in the high jump, she cleared the same height as the winner, but was placed second on a technical ruling about her jumping style, which she performed headfirst in a way officials judged illegal at the time. 2 golds and a contested silver, in an Olympics where she was only allowed to enter a fraction of what she could do. She came home a national celebrity, and then she needed to make a living, which was the problem that shaped everything that followed, because there was essentially no money in women's amateur sport, and taking money cost you your amateur status. So Babe did what she had to, which was exhibitions. She toured. She played basketball on a barnstorming team. She pitched in exhibition baseball games against major league players, and there are accounts of her striking out serious hitters. She played billiards. She was, briefly, a vaudeville act, where she'd run on a treadmill, play the harmonica, which she was genuinely good at, and hit golf balls into the audience. That's how she got into golf, essentially, as part of an act. And then she decided to take it seriously, and the story becomes about the most difficult thing she ever attempted. Golf was not like her other sports. Her advantage everywhere else had been raw athleticism, speed, strength, and coordination that simply overwhelmed people. Golf punishes that. Golf is a technical game where power without control is worse than useless. So she did the unglamorous thing. She practiced, in the way that people who are actually great practice, which is to say obsessively and past the point of reason. Accounts describe her hitting balls until her hands were taped and bleeding, 12 hours at a stretch, thousands of shots a day. She took instruction seriously, worked on the parts of the game that weren't natural, and built a short game to go with the length. And she was long. She was hitting drives at distances that, in the 1930s and 40s, made male professionals stop and look. And then came the amateur status problem, which is genuinely one of the pettier episodes in golf history. Because she'd earned money from those exhibitions and other sports, the USGA ruled her a professional, which barred her from amateur competition. There was no meaningful women's professional tour to play instead, so she was, effectively, locked out of the top of the sport she'd just committed to. She had to serve a 3-year waiting period to have her amateur status restored. 3 years of her prime, waiting, because she'd previously earned a living. When it was restored, she made up for it very fast. In 1946, she won the US Women's Amateur. In 1947, she went to Britain and won the British Ladies Amateur, becoming the first American ever to do so. And in that stretch, she put together a run of consecutive tournament victories that is one of the great streaks in golf, reported at somewhere between 13 and 17 events, depending on how you count them. It's worth sitting with what that streak actually was, because runs like that basically don't happen in golf. Golf is the sport least suited to dominance. The margins are tiny, the conditions change every week, and a single bad hour on a Thursday morning removes you entirely. That's why even the greatest players in history win a fraction of the events they enter. Winning 3 in a row is a career highlight for most professionals. Babe won somewhere between 13 and 17 consecutive tournaments, depending on which events you count and how you treat a couple of disputed entries. Either number is barely comprehensible. It means she went the better part of a year without losing, across different courses, different weather, different fields, while being the most watched person in every gallery. And she did it with a game that had been assembled deliberately rather than inherited. That's the part that gets lost when people call her a natural athlete. The athleticism was natural. The golf was manufactured, in a shed, over years, by someone who decided she was going to be good at it and treated that as a job. There's also the personality, which mattered enormously to what came next. Babe was not a quiet champion. She talked. She was funny, boastful, theatrical, and completely unbothered about how that landed. There are dozens of recorded instances of her walking into a locker room at a tournament and asking who was playing for second. She'd tell galleries what she was about to do, and then do it. Some of that was genuine confidence. A lot of it was strategy, and she was explicit about it later. She understood, earlier than almost anyone in women's sport, that attention was the scarce resource. Nobody was going to buy tickets to watch a modest, deferential woman play golf quietly. So she gave them a character, and the character sold tickets, and the tickets were the only route to the sport existing at all. That's a real and underappreciated form of intelligence. She was building an audience for a product that didn't exist yet, using the only asset she had, which was herself. It also made her enemies, and it's worth being honest about that. Some of her fellow players found her exhausting. The boasting was not universally charming, and there are accounts of resentment in the early LPGA about how much of the oxygen she took. That's a fair criticism of a person and a bad criticism of a strategy, because the tour those players were competing on existed substantially because of the oxygen she took. Which brings us to the men. Babe played in men's professional events on several occasions. In 1938, she entered the Los Angeles Open, becoming the first woman to play in a PGA Tour event. She didn't make the cut, but she made an impression, and she also met her future husband there, the wrestler George Zaharias, who was paired with her. Then, in 1945, she came back and did the thing that actually mattered. At the Los Angeles Open that year, she shot rounds of 76 and 81, which was good enough to make the 36-hole cut. She became the first woman to make a cut in a men's professional tournament. She played the weekend. She finished the event. She then entered the Phoenix Open and the Tucson Open in the same stretch. Now, it's important to be accurate about the context, because the mythology tends to inflate it. These were tournaments where she was playing on a sponsor's invitation, and the fields in early 1945 were affected by the war, with a number of the top players in military service. She was not beating Byron Nelson head-to-head. But none of that changes the essential fact, which is that a woman entered men's professional tournaments and demonstrated, on the scorecard, that she could compete at that level. She wasn't a novelty who shot 95 and went home. She made the cut. And there's a piece of context that makes the achievement clearer, which is what she was actually giving up in distance. Golf in 1945 was played with equipment that punished everyone, but it punished shorter hitters most. Wooden-headed drivers, wound balls, no launch optimization, and courses that were not manicured the way they are now. Getting the ball in play off the tee and then reaching greens in regulation took genuine length, and length was the single clearest physical gap between men's and women's golf. Babe closed a meaningful part of that gap through raw athleticism. She was, by contemporary accounts, hitting drives around 250 yards, which in that era was long for a male professional, never mind a woman. Male players who saw her practice commented on it repeatedly, and some of them clearly found it unsettling. That's why the cut in Los Angeles is the number that matters. Making a cut is a total game test. It means you drove it well enough, hit enough greens, avoided disaster, and putted competently over 2 full rounds against people who did that for a living. You cannot fake your way to it with one strength. And the response of the golf establishment to that demonstration is the part of this story that still lands badly. Rather than treating it as a remarkable and interesting development, the position hardened. The PGA of America moved to a clear men-only stance on entry and membership, and the door that Babe had walked through was shut behind her. For decades afterwards, no woman played a PGA Tour event, and it would be more than half a century before another woman teed it up in one. That's the sentence at the center of this story. She proved she could do it, and the rule was changed so it couldn't be done again. And it's worth being precise about why that matters, because you'll hear people argue the physical case, that men hit it further and the fields are deeper, which is true. But that's not what happened here. Nobody tested her over a season and found her wanting. She played, she qualified, she made the cut, and then the opportunity was removed. The question was never allowed to be answered. And there's a comparison worth making, because it shows how unusual the reaction was. Sport in that era was full of exhibition crossovers. Baseball players boxed, boxers wrestled, athletes from every discipline turned up in each other's events for money and publicity, and promoters loved it because novelty sold tickets. Babe herself had built years of income on exactly that appetite. So the appearance of a woman in a men's golf tournament, in a decade that cheerfully staged all sorts of stunts, could easily have been absorbed as another spectacle. Golf could have shrugged, taken the gate money, and moved on. It didn't, and the reason is that she didn't behave like a stunt. A stunt shoots 92 and waves at the crowd. She turned in a scorecard that qualified her for the weekend, which converted the question from entertainment into precedent. Novelty is harmless. Precedent isn't. Once one woman makes a cut, the next entry isn't a curiosity, it's a competitor, and the field has to consider that its results could be beaten by people it had assumed were categorically excluded. That's the thing institutions move fastest to prevent, and it explains the timing. The door didn't close after she failed. It closed after she succeeded. So she did the other thing available to her, which is arguably a bigger contribution than any tournament win. She built the tour. In 1950, Babe was one of the 13 founders of the Ladies Professional Golf Association, and she wasn't a name on a letterhead, she was the engine. She was the biggest draw in women's sport in America, and she used that. She played, she promoted, she gave interviews, she performed, she made sure there were spectators and sponsors and press coverage where previously there had been almost nothing. The early LPGA existed in large part because Babe Zaharias could fill a gallery. She won the US Women's Open 3 times. She was the leading money winner repeatedly. She was, in the most literal sense, the product that made the tour saleable. And it's worth understanding how precarious that early tour actually was, because it puts her contribution in proportion. The LPGA in its first years was not a professional circuit in any modern sense. There were very few events. The purses were small enough that a winner might take home a few $100s. The players drove themselves between tournaments, often sharing cars, and frequently did their own promotion, ringing local newspapers to get a mention and persuading clubs to host them at all. Several of the founders were doing administrative work for the organization in the evenings after playing in it during the day. There was no infrastructure, no television, and no guarantee any of it would exist the following season. In that environment, one thing keeps a tour alive, which is a reason for someone to come and watch. Babe was that reason. She was a household name from the Olympics. She was a spectacle in her own right, and she had a genuine crossover audience of people who did not otherwise care about golf. So when she played, galleries appeared, and when galleries appeared, clubs were willing to host, and sponsors were willing to put up purses, and newspapers sent reporters. That is the entire mechanism by which a sport bootstraps itself, and she was most of it. Which is also why what happened next nearly killed the tour as well as her. And then, in 1953, at the peak of it, she was diagnosed with colon cancer. She was 42. She had surgery, including a colostomy, which in the medical context of the early 1950s was a far more brutal and life-altering procedure than the modern equivalent, with far less support and far more stigma. The medical expectation was that her competitive career was finished. 14 weeks after major cancer surgery, she was back playing tournament golf. And in 1954, roughly a year after the operation, wearing a colostomy bag, she won the US Women's Open. Not scraped to win, she won it by 12 strokes. That is, by a wide margin, the most remarkable single achievement in this entire story, and it's the one people know least about. A woman in her 40s, recovering from cancer surgery that had removed part of her colon, playing 4 rounds of championship golf in the American summer, and winning the national championship by 12. She won several more events after that. She was named Woman Athlete of the Year for a 6th time, and then the cancer came back, and this time it didn't stop. She died in September 1956, at 45 years old. It's worth pausing on that age, because it changes how you read the whole record. 45 is not the end of a golfer's competitive life. Plenty of players win significant events into their 40s, and the era of senior golf that came later would have been made for her, given how much of her appeal was showmanship and how well her game aged. So everything in this story is the first half of a career. The Olympic golds, the amateur titles, the opens, founding a tour, and the comeback. All of it happened before the point at which most sporting lives are only becoming interesting. There's no way to know what the rest would have contained. What we do know is that the last 3 years of it was spent playing tournament golf against doctors' expectations and using whatever platform that generated to talk about a disease nobody would name in public. In the last period of her life, she did something that also deserves recording. She spoke publicly about her diagnosis in an era when cancer was something people did not discuss, particularly not colon cancer, and particularly not a woman in public life. She raised money for cancer research and set up a fund in her own name. She made her illness visible on purpose because she understood that her being visible was the useful thing she had. And I want to be specific about what winning that Open actually required, because she won a golf tournament after cancer, undersells it in a way that's almost disrespectful. Championship golf is 4 rounds over 4 days. That's roughly 20 hours of competition, walking somewhere in the region of 25 miles across the week, carrying the physical and mental load of a national championship in summer heat. Now do it with a body that has been surgically opened and rebuilt within the year. Do it with a colostomy in 1954, with the equipment available in 1954, which was crude, uncomfortable, and prone to failure, and which she had to manage privately on a golf course in front of galleries, with no facilities designed for any of it, and no possibility of discussing it. Do it while your own stamina is a fraction of what it was, and while every competitor in the field is healthy, and win by 12 shots. 12 strokes in a major is not a good week. 12 strokes is the field being irrelevant. It's the kind of margin that happens perhaps once in a generation when everything aligns for a player at the peak of their powers, and she produced it in the worst physical condition of her life. There's a detail from that period that I find harder to shake than the score. She was in significant discomfort for much of the round and said very little about it, and afterwards she talked mainly about wanting other cancer patients to see it, not about the golf, about what the golf was for. So how do you actually assess her? The Associated Press named her the greatest female athlete of the first half of the 20th century, and later polls have put her at or near the top of the century as a whole. And the case is genuinely hard to argue with, because the standard objection to any greatest athlete claim is that the person was great at one thing. Babe Didrikson Zaharias was an Olympic gold medalist in 2 athletics disciplines, an All-American basketball player, a credible exhibition baseball pitcher, and then, in an entirely separate career, one of the dominant golfers in the world and the co-founder of the tour that still exists today. That's not versatility. That's 4 careers, any one of which would be a life's achievement. And the golf part is the one that carries the sting, because it's the one where she ran directly into an institution that had decided in advance what she was allowed to be. There's one more thing worth saying, about how quickly the specific detail got lost. Babe Zaharias is not a forgotten figure. She's in every Hall of Fame that applies. She has awards named after her, and if you ask a golf historian, they'll tell you she was extraordinary. But the 1945 cut, the actual fact of it, is not part of the sport's story about itself. It doesn't come up when golf discusses its own history. When a woman was later invited to play a PGA Tour event, decades afterwards, the coverage overwhelmingly treated it as unprecedented, because, for practical purposes, the earlier instance had been filed away. That's what an institution does with an inconvenient result. It doesn't deny it, it just stops repeating it. And after enough decades of not being repeated, a thing that happened becomes a thing that people are surprised to learn happened. Which is why the number is worth stating plainly one more time. 76 and 81 made the cut, played the weekend. Here's what I keep coming back to. Golf spent decades telling itself that the beauty of the game is that the ball doesn't care who's hitting it. The scorecard is the great equalizer. That's the sport's favorite thing to say about itself. And in January 1945, a woman handed in a scorecard that made the cut in a men's professional tournament. And the sport's response was to make sure the scorecard would never get the chance again. She wasn't beaten, she was excluded. And the difference between those two things is the entire story.